The conventional wisdom is European countries are great at passenger rail and the US is terrible. The conventional wisdom is basically right, but it wasn't always. So brace yourself, because today we're getting in a time machine to visit the lost world of our nation's glorious passenger rail history, find out what we can learn from it, but mostly just feel sad. This is CityNerd, weekly content on cities and transportation. Viewer-suggested topics always welcome, and I've had a couple twists on this one, like a top 10 list of the US city pairs that had historically the most daily trips, or like using my gravity model thingamajig to analyze historic train routes that no longer exist, and using that as a way to talk about Amtrak's Connect Us US plan. So you know I love making top 10 lists, and both of these ideas were pretty cool. Like, I thought it would be super fun to hoe through a bunch of old timetables and recreate historical frequencies for a bunch of city pairs. But man, once I started actually digging into the research, I realized it was going to be a monumental task, and it was just going to take me to a very dark place. Like, it's literally overwhelming how much passenger rail service the US and Canada used to have. I made a whole video about the sort of phantom limb that still remains from where the streetcars used to run in LA. And I think we always mourn the loss of streetcars in our cities, and we entertain conspiracy theories. And those conspiracy theories may or may not have merit to them, but there's no doubt that the rise of the private automobile and all of the marketing and lobbying that came with it led to the decline of urban rail transit. And I just suggest that this is no less true of our intercity passenger rail. I mean, if you go to Europe, those countries maintained and modernized their rail systems, and rail is a great way, often the preferred way, to get from city to city there, and in the US, we either dismantled it or just flat out neglected it. So, you know I have like two different kinds of videos I make. It's either a top 10 list where I do a bunch of analysis, or I go out on a location in a city, film a bunch of stuff, and then tell you what I think about it. Today, though, I'm going to take you on a journey of human wonder and raw emotion. I don't want to say it's a journey to a better world. I mean, we're talking about a time that predates environmental law, civil rights, and non-smoking sections. But in terms of train frequency and coverage, it's a shockingly better world. So first, huge credit to the website Timetable World, which is a sort of clearinghouse for high quality scans of map and schedule information from every geography and year they can find. Linked down in the description, and trust me, you'll lose days of your life once you go down this rabbit hole, and you'll get depressed, but it'll be well worth it. Anyway, what I went with here is the 1925 edition of the Official Guide of the Railways, which is a compendium of all the services in North America, and it numbers in the thousands of pages. I chose 1925 because it's close to the peak of US passenger rail ridership, which really occurs at the emergence of the mass-produced automobile, and the scan quality on this particular document is pretty good. It's a huge trove of information, and one of the fun things is realizing this is how people used to understand schedules. You didn't have a back-end database with website code that could assemble itineraries and travel options for you, so that makes the research really tedious but interesting in its own way. Like, how do timetables account for carriages that get uncoupled from one train and recoupled with another during a journey, which is a thing that happens? Long story short, but this is not going to be an exhaustive accounting of all train services available in 1925. Okay, before we get to the meat of what I want to talk about today, let's look at a couple things that just absolutely jumped out at me. Like, if you watched my video on Union stations, you know Winnipeg just has this glorious train station, but it serves like one train a day. Well, if you look at the Canadian national map from 1925, you start to understand why Winnipeg Union Station is such an imposing structure. A personal favorite, the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway. 2 trains a day from Portland to one of my all-time favorite small cities, Astoria. The rails are all still there. They just run seasonal vintage trolleys on them now. And I'm not actually going to spend that much time on the Northeast Corridor today, other than to point out the eastern seaboard from northern Virginia to the southern tip of Maine has more density than anywhere in Europe, and it does have today more train service than anywhere else in the US by a long shot. But even though the population today is quite a bit higher than it was in 1925, there was more train service everywhere. Even our busiest city pair for trains, New York to Philadelphia, which has about 50 a day, had more service in 1925 just on the Pennsylvania Railroad alone. And that's not counting all the additional trains you could get on the Reading Line or the Baltimore and Ohio. All of these big systems connected to the Midwest though, and for most of the history of the US, the nation really was the Northeast Corridor and the Midwest. I talked about this in my baseball video where, until the second half of the 20th century, all the action was in this upper right-hand quadrant of the nation. Well, I'm talking about 1925, so let's look at the 10 largest cities by population in the decennial counts of 1920 and 1930. It's actually the same 10 cities both years. It's just Los Angeles more than doubles in size. Still doesn't get a baseball team until 1958 though. But the point is, look at how Midwest cities represent. It's not as dense a region as the eastern seaboard, but here's what I want to emphasize. Today, in 2023, there's sort of a hidden nation that's around the size of Spain in land area, but has more and bigger cities and a bigger population overall. Yet Spain, a less affluent country by just about any measure, has basically infinitely more intercity rail service than our fantasy Midwest nation state. So I want to spend a bit of time walking through the lost world of Midwest intercity rail. And I'm not even talking about all the East Coast based services that connected to some of these cities, because that's like a whole other video in itself. What I'm talking about is stuff like the Wabash Railway, which connected to a lot of the Great Lakes cities and was one of the many services you could use to get between Chicago and St. Louis. Don't sleep on the Banner Blue Limited, aka the Train of Trains, featuring exquisitely furnished dining cars. The Nickel Plate Road covered a lot of the same area, just different routes. It would honestly take me hours just to talk about all the railways that connected this whole region, but let's just focus in on one of them for a minute. And that's the Big Four route, which was owned by the New York Central but operated under separate branding. So Indianapolis is another one of these cities that has an impressive central train station and almost no passenger service today. 3 trains a week on the Cardinal, I think. Well, just look how important this city was in connecting this constellation of Midwestern cities. I started trying to count up all the trains you could get every day out of Indianapolis, and I just gave up because the whole exercise was just too depressing. Also, can we all just agree that it's absolutely insane there isn't a 3C train in Ohio? The Big Four ran a ton of service every day. Like, if I want to do a 3C trip next year, do I have to rent a car? Because I'm not doing that. Anyway, as the saying goes, but wait, there's more. The Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railway also ran a ton of service through Indianapolis. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad connected up the southern part of our fantasy nation state and points south. Or you could just keep it simple. The Louisville, Henderson, and St. Louis Railway, it's just a direct line with modern equipment. Let's talk about St. Louis for a bit. Possibly the most architecturally glorious passenger rail station in the Americas, and it doesn't even have trains anymore. I won't dwell on the current state of things because I did that in the Union Stations video, but it was quite literally the gateway to the fast-growing states of California and Texas. Let's hit a couple services. The Missouri Pacific, which included the Sunshine Special to Hot Springs National Park, featuring the finest of dining. The Texas and Pacific converged on St. Louis Union Station. The Frisco lines went into Union Station. I kind of wanted to count up the number of trains a day that served Union Station, a station that currently serves 0 trains, but I was a bit afraid it would send me into therapy. Suffice to say, there aren't that many network maps in this whole guide that don't have a St. Louis connection. Okay, in a minute I'm going to zero in on what's pretty obviously the most important city in this fantasy nation state I've constructed. But first, quick reminder to drop a like on the video and subscribe / click the notification bell if you're a masochist who likes wallowing in railway timetables from a century ago. Connect in all the usual places and consider becoming a patron if you want to support what's really like a morphine drip of urbanism outrage once a week. Okay, before I dive back into this, let's acknowledge that up until 1920 or so, rail was the only real way to get between inland cities. Maybe there were a couple riverboats, but in 1925, we're talking about a period when personal automobiles are just starting to enter the picture. And commercial aviation would really take off just after the Second World War. So there are a lot of factors that really change the competitive landscape. But on the other hand, this country's population has more than tripled in the last century, and every other industrially advanced nation on the planet has seemingly maintained or expanded their rail service. I'll come back to this, but for now, let's go to the epicenter of our fantasy nation state, a world where Chicago is definitely not the second city. Some of the services from 1925 still actually exist, but this is a completely different world. I mean, just the Illinois Central alone had ridiculous amounts of service all over the state, and if it was winter and you had some vacation time, they had you covered. The Chicago and Alton, you guys, there was so much service between Chicago and St. Louis on so many different railways, it just makes me want to cry. You could do the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, which was the noiseless route. Yeah, I don't know what that means either. Also with service down to the Sunshine State because it's Chicago and winter is a thing that happens. I think the original question I got was service between Chicago and Milwaukee, but how about service to just basically all of Wisconsin? I'm not even going to tell you how many trains there were because it'll just make you sad. The Union Pacific ran just about everything out of Chicago. The Rock Island also used Chicago as a main hub for services west and south, including the Golden State Limited, luxurious and congenial with manicures. The Santa Fe terminated in Chicago. Very cool that you could take it to Earth's scenic wonder. I will do a video on transit connections to natural areas at some point, but 100 years ago, you got the Fred Harvey Railway Meal Service, conceived with high ideals, 50 years in the making, sigh. Today, you'd be lucky to get like a cup of noodles on the Southwest Chief. The Burlington routes emanated out of Chicago to everywhere west. The Milwaukee Road, more service to the west and just tons more service to Milwaukee and the Twin Cities. So now you know why there's so much defunct rail infrastructure in Minneapolis. The Chicago Great Western went there too, and the Minneapolis and St. Louis. And let's not forget the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sault Ste. Marie Railway, or Soo Line. Do you know how many daily trains there are between Chicago and Minneapolis today? I don't even want to talk about it. The Great Northern, I think some of this is the Empire Builder route right now. Service to the Pacific Northwest through the Twin Cities and Glacier National Park. The Northern Pacific, also running through the Twin Cities out of Chicago, took the southern route through Montana, serving Yellowstone. It just sounds so cool. Look, I'm not trying to say we should be building billions of dollars of rail infrastructure through Montana, but having true high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor is super obvious. And even the Midwestern US is denser than a lot of countries that have amazing high-speed rail service. It's 2023, the US is still a very rich country, and our evergreen big brain idea is, apparently, widening freeways, while practically every other industrialized nation is, idiotically, I guess, building high-speed rail. Just name me a decent-sized country that's anywhere near the US's GDP per capita that doesn't have bullet trains. Even countries like Indonesia, Turkey, and Morocco have figured this one out. Even Saudi Arabia has high-speed rail, and I guess when your country's that rich, you can just build whatever you want. But I was surprised to find out it doesn't feature that prominently in The Logistics of Hajj, which is the name of a great new video from the Wendover team. I don't need to tell you that 2 million people descending on a city that's roughly the size of Jacksonville, Florida, is a logistical nightmare. And the video does a great job of laying it all out, including some pretty eye-popping claims about the Mecca metro system. I won't spoil it for you. The Logistics of Hajj from Wendover's The Logistics of X series is a Nebula original, and it's another great example of Nebula creators tackling topics they'd have a tough time pulling off without a platform that supports ambitious ideas. Remember, Nebula is creator-owned, so when you sign up, you're supporting a platform that's designed to support us, the creators, in a long-term, structural way, financially, professionally, and creatively. So if you want to support this channel's ability to grow in all those ways, signing up for Nebula is a great way to do that, but also because the content is just really good. The Nebula subscription does now come with classes, and here's one I got a lot out of. How to make a nerd sync video. Not the same niche as I'm working in, but definitely deals with the same kind of production challenges I do, so just fascinating to watch. So if you sign up for Nebula with the link down in the description, you get all the Nebula content, including classes, and you can get it all for the usual deal of $250 a month, which is 40% off the usual price. But in September 2023, you can do a lifetime membership for $300. Now, whether that's a good deal for you or not is a private matter between you and your preferred actuarial table. But what it is a fantastic way to support all of us here on Nebula, me in particular, if you use my custom link. And you'll be cranking up the budget for the Nebula Originals program. But whichever way you go, you'll be supporting this channel in a way that really makes a difference. Anyway, I don't even know how to wrap this up and put a bow on it, so I'm just gonna leave you as frustrated as I am, having immersed myself in century-old timetables for a whole week. You are welcome, and that is all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks to the patrons. As always, your direct support really does mean a lot. Keep the great topic suggestions coming, and the city visit destination suggestions. I'll be back with a new installment next week, and I'll see you then.